Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm really excited to be here, and I'd especially like to thank Sylvie Andrews for inviting me to speak. And Sylvie and we were colleagues at the Pittock Mansion several years ago, and it was a real pleasure to get to work alongside her at Pittock, and I'm just really happy to be working with Sylvie again in this capacity. I have such great admiration for Sylvie and the wonderful work that she's doing here at the Gresham Historical Society. So in the intro, Sylvie, or in the very long bio that I made Sylvie read, she'd mentioned the winter 2021 special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And so I thought that today's talk, I would start with this special issue. So I wanted to use this journal issue as a way to look at the history of Oregon's earliest Chinese people and the significance of this history as it relates to the history of the state and of the region, of the nation. So I guest co-edited this special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly with Chelsea Rose, who is a historical archaeologist based at Southern Oregon University. And she's also the head of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, which is doing really phenomenal work across the state she's an archaeologist, so they're like literally uncovering the history of Oregon, of Chinese people in Oregon. So Chelsea's job for this special issue was to pull together the submissions, and since she's been doing work across the state, it was very, very. I don't want to say easy, but she had the connections. She was aware of the work. She knew what was happening, and so she pulled in the submissions, and it was my job to read over the submissions and synthesize them for the introduction for this special issue. And so for me, in the process of reviewing these submissions, I had the opportunity to learn so much about the current field of research taking place on this subject. And I was just really impressed and surprised by the breadth of articles and of research being presented, that was presented here. This special issue has articles about a Chinese cowboy who lived near John Day, Oregon. It has articles about Chinese merchants in the Dalles, Chinese would-be immigrants flouting immigration restrictions to get into the country. There are reports of archaeological excavations of railroad tunnels in the Malheur National Forest. There's also a really wonderful biography of Louis Chung, who's pictured here with his wife, whose life embodied many of the historical shifts and trajectories that Chinese people experienced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A lot of the scholarship that was presented in this special issue I would say it's previously unknown work, previously unknown knowledge. And when you take the articles together as a whole, I think that it really forces us, it forces a rethinking of Oregon's past, and also offers us new ways of thinking about how Oregon was connected to the rest of the world, to the United States, and to the Pacific world. So in the popular imagination, when we think about the American West, there are certain images that come to mind. There's an image of the empty frontier, which, as we know, is false. Then there's the image of individualistic pioneers coming and settling in a vast empty space. I think that these images, especially if you're not living in this part of the country, really loom very large in people's imaginations of the American West. It really predominates the ways that the West has been mythologized in American popular memory. This particular narrative of westward migration, it not only obscures the indigenous history of the region and indigenous claims to the land, but it also whitewashes the population of people who played a role in this displacement. The reality of Oregon's first non-indigenous settlers are that they weren't quite as homogenous as people have tended to think they were. We have, through the work of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project and also the Oregon Black Pioneers, we know that there were Black pioneers, there were Asian pioneers settling alongside white pioneers in this place. We know that people came from the East, but we also know that they crossed the Pacific Ocean. We know that they also came from the South, and they also came from the North. We also know that there were some degrees of coexistence between these populations as well. The diversity of this population really comes into view, I think, as soon as we start to center these folks into the history of this place, rather than talk about them as kind of just an additional paragraph. As soon as we integrate that into the bigger narrative, that's when we can start to get, I think, a fuller picture of this place. So Chinese people lived and worked and built communities. They created businesses and social connections throughout the state. And what we know as well as is that these folks, they came here as early as 1850, nearly a decade before Oregon had even become a state. And the earliest of these the earliest Chinese Oregonians who came here likely came by way of California in search of gold. We also know that early Chinese Oregonians were settling across the state. So this map is a little, you can't see it that well over here, but this map highlights various areas of known Chinese settlement or community. And this was created in 2021, and I want to say now that this map is already outdated because there are many more points on the map now. We know that folks were settling across the state, and we know that they were building communities of varying sizes in places that have virtually no Chinese residents today, like Jacksonville, for instance, or the Malheur National Forest. We also know that people were settling in areas that continued to have large Chinese populations, including Portland and Salem, the Dalles, Ashland. And we also know that through census records, which generally undercount non-white people, we see that at different times during the first 50 years of the state, Chinese people comprised significant portions of the population. So in the 1870 census, we see in the 1870 census, in Grant County, 42% of that general population was Chinese. In Jackson County, 12% of that population was Chinese. In Josephine County, 19% of that population was Chinese. In the 1880 census, in Clatsop County and Astoria, nearly 30% of that population was Chinese. In 1890, in Portland, nearly 10% of that population was Chinese. Before the turn of the 20th century, and for many years after, Oregon's Chinese population was actually the second largest in the United States. Oregon, I think, gets characterized as a very white state. And in some part, when you look at the statistics, yes, that is true. But another reason why this belief persists is because the dominant histories of the state have a tendency to overlook or ignore the many different groups of people of color who were here from early on. So it's not just it's not just about the numbers, but it's also about the way that we remember the past and how the ways that we have remembered the past has tended to ignore the existence of these populations. Early Chinese migrants made a living in Oregon in a number of different ways. And I think that this fact is really worth emphasizing because there's a long-held, I think, assumption or stereotype that early Chinese immigrants were like all unskilled workers, or they only worked building the railroad or as miners or in laundries and restaurants. But the reality of how Chinese people made a living in Oregon is actually a little bit more complex. So yes, on one hand, you do have, general laborers, but you also have highly skilled craftsmen and cowboys. You also have businessmen, labor contractors, entrepreneurs, and all of these people were working within highly organized transnational business networks and partnerships. Like, they were working in coordination with folks in China. They were working in coordination with folks across the United States. So people are working, I guess, they are connected to each other, and they are working within these business networks and social networks as well. Some folks amassed significant wealth working as labor contractors, recruiting Chinese laborers to work in white and Chinese-owned industrial and agricultural endeavors. One such example is, this is Jin Lin. He was a prominent mining boss. We know that he was a labor contractor, he earned a fortune, and eventually made enough money to return to China. I mean, basically, I think very close to being a millionaire. And then over here, we have an image of Ying He and Lung An, who were the owners of Kam Wah Chung in John Day, Oregon. Has anyone been to Kam Wah Chung? It's really wonderful, wonderful place in John Day. By all accounts, Ying He and Lung An were pillars of the community in John Day. Lung An was a very successful businessman who would eventually, during his lifetime, he would open the first automobile dealership east of the Cascades. And I mean, he was also the first Chinese American to own an automobile dealership. And we also have Ying He, who was a well-respected practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine, and he treated patients both Chinese and white alike. Another famous example, whom I think folks here maybe have heard of, is Bing, for whom the Bing cherry is named after. Bing, during the second half of the 19th century, Bing worked as a foreman of Seth Llewellyn's orchards in Milwaukee. And he's credited to varying degrees for cultivating the popular cherry. So in rural and in urban places across the state, early Chinese Oregonians worked in nearly all of Oregon's industries. They ranged from poor laborers to millionaires. Some people like Ying He and Lung An, and even Louis Chung, who was on the cover of the Oregon Historical Quarterly, were pillars of their community among both fellow Chinese people and non-Chinese peers alike. Others were run out of town by angry mobs. This is all to say that there's a range of experience, and that, that there is importance in recognizing that there is this range and nuance. So I want to talk a little bit right now about how Chinese people in Oregon lived transnational lives. And what I mean by that is that Chinese Oregonians maintained deep and sustained connections to China, to their home villages, and to their provinces. And these connections were maintained in many different ways. So, also that many early Chinese Oregonians, if not most of them, regardless of their line of work or their class status, operated within these fairly complex transnational business and social systems and networks. I think that there's oftentimes an assumption, maybe, that for immigrants, particularly early immigrants, that when they come to, when they leave their homeland and immigrate to a new place, that's it. They're in the new place and they don't have any more connections to the old place, and they never go back and they never see their families again. And that's, you know, it certainly could be true in many cases, but at the same time, like, the reality is that people did go back and forth, especially in this period for Chinese people. People took the steamship between the United States and China. That was pretty common. People wrote letters back and forth. People sent money back home. People maintained families in China and lived in America. This was just this flow back and forth of people was a pretty common fixture for immigrant life, you know, in this time period, just as it is today, I think. So for Chinese people in this period in time, these transnational realities offer a line of connection between Oregon and China. This is, you know, this network of money, of people, of business interests, so on and so forth. This is a way that connects Oregon to Asia, to China, to the Pacific world. It drives home the fact that the development of the state was spurred in part not only by foreign labor, but also by foreign capital and foreign ideas as well. This example here, this is, these types of buildings are called diaolo, and these particular buildings are located in Kaiping, China, which is in the Guangdong province of China. It's in southern China. It's a rural area. So these buildings are fortified structures. There are around 1,800 of these types of structures in the Pearl River Delta region of southern China, the area where the majority of Chinese immigrants came from. These fortified buildings blend Chinese and Western architecture. Oh, it's too bad you can't. So they blend Chinese and Western architecture, and perhaps more importantly, they were almost entirely funded by remittances sent back home by Chinese laborers in the United States and throughout the diaspora. So this is like physical example of this relationship that people had between home village and new land, if you will. So one of the reasons why we don't know more about this early population of Oregonians is that Chinese people in Oregon have been twice erased from the popular memory and dominant histories of this state. This erasure, it's a two-step process. This erasure happens first through restrictive and discriminatory legislation, which dramatically reduced the population of Chinese people in America and Chinese people in the state, and also led to political, social, and economic marginalization of the Chinese people who stayed in the United States. So that's the first step. You have like laws that change and reduce the population and marginalize the population. And then you have the second form of erasure that happens through the production and reproduction of historical scholarship. So how history is made, how ideas are crafted, how ideas are passed down and disseminated. This is the second form of erasure that happens to Chinese people in Oregon. So I would say that the history of Chinese Oregonians, maybe until just recently, tended to, or histories of Oregon, if you will, tended to ignore or misinterpret the experiences of Chinese Oregonians, oftentimes diminishing the complexities of this population through either, an Orientalist or a Eurocentric lens. I have this picture here. I think you guys can see a few bits of it. This is an image of Block 14 at Lone Fir Cemetery. Oh, you know what, actually? Sorry, I want to go back and talk about this Promontory Point photograph. This image here is the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Point in Utah. This is where the connecting of the Transcontinental Railroad. This photograph was taken in 1869, and we know that generally Irish Americans made up the bulk of the labor force that helped build the railroad from the east to the west. We also know that Chinese people made up the bulk of the labor force that built the railroad from the west to the east. Here they join in Utah, and there is not a single Chinese person in this photograph. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about erasure. It's like through just a number of small-ish, seemingly inconsequential actions like this. Here we have a photograph of, or photographs of Block 14 at Lone Fir Cemetery. This is in Portland, Oregon, in Southeast. This is, I believe, the oldest operating cemetery in Portland. It was a pioneer cemetery. At the corner of Morrison and 20th in Lone Fir is Block 14. Block 14 was a Chinese burial site from about the 1870s until about 1920-ish. We know that up to 2,000 Chinese people were buried at Block 14, possibly, I can't get the number straight, but it's somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people. This is what Block 14 looks like today. It's an empty patch of land. You wouldn't know, like there's a bus stop right in front of it. It just looks like an empty part of the cemetery. But this is what Block 14 looked like in the early 1900s. So you can see a funerary altar. This here is, it was a bone house to house human remains to prepare them for transport back to China, which was a very common practice for Chinese people, especially those for whom, home was back in China. That's where they wanted their remains to go. That's where they wanted their final resting place to be. But you can see this altar. You can see headstones in the back. This was a Chinese burial ground. And then basically, it's a long, complicated story, but basically what happened is that Multnomah County took over control of the cemetery. They coerced the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association to disinter all people from this burial ground. And they built a building and a parking lot on top of it. And then in 2005, they tore that building down. And they wanted to sell it to developers. But there was knowledge that this space used to be a burial ground for Chinese people. And so I think there was a lot of public pressure to have the county do an archaeological assessment. As soon as they dug, they found remains. And so ever since 2005, this is what the lot looks like. This is what that burial ground looks like. There has not been any development on top of it because there are remains. So right now there's a project that's organized by it's a metro project to build a heritage and healing garden on the site to kind of reclaim that story, to share that story, and to provide a place for people to come and engage with that history. But I shared these images here because, when thinking about erasure, this is also what erasure looks like. I had a conversation with someone who was working on a project in Block 14, and they said something to the effect of the the European American builders and founders of this city have names and buildings named after them. And yet the Chinese who literally built Portland don't even have gravestones. And so, this is, it's just another example of what I'm talking about. This is an image of Portland's First Street, circa 1857. This, I think, also offers such a great illustration of this point that I'm trying to make about erasure. So pictured here is Portland, 2 years before Oregon became a state. This is First Avenue, which would have been considered a central part of Portland. The photograph is actually one of the earliest known photographs that we have of Portland. So to me, I'm from the East Coast, so I guess I come with my own baggage about what the West looks like. But to me, this scene looks kind of like a stereotypical frontier town. I see muddy streets. I see horse-drawn carriages. I see sidewalks made of wooden planks. I see buildings that look like they were all kind of put up at about the same time. And yet, here, front and center, the only clear signage that we can see in this photograph is the Hop Wo washing and ironing. This is a Chinese-operated laundry. This is a Chinese-owned laundry. So how does the Hop Wo here in this landscape, and then the census data that I just shared with you, and the sheer diversity of immigrant experiences among these early Chinese migrants, when you take all this together, how does this challenge the assumptions that we have about what the early history of this place looked like? To me, this begs the question of why aren't Chinese people more integrated into the history of Oregon? And when we do work these early settlers into the dominant ways that we talk about the history of Oregon, how does that change our understanding of this place and of this country? And how does this, knowing that that's the Hop Wo laundry, how does this change your assumption of what you see on this street? Who you imagine the people would look like walking down the street? How does that change it a little bit? So I want to talk a little bit just about kind of this general history of Chinese people in Oregon. So from the mid-1800s to 1943, the overwhelming majority of Chinese people who came to the United States, Oregon included, were Cantonese Chinese. Most of these individuals came from rural villages in the Pearl River Delta region. That's that province that's shaded in that goldish brown color. So most of these individuals came from rural villages in the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong province in southern China. During the second half of the 19th century in China, there was social and political unrest. There was unsustainable population density, and there was economic uncertainty that was much more pronounced in this region than it was in other parts of the country. And so that's why you have stronger outmigration from this region as opposed to, further north, for example. So one of the largest sending districts was Taishan or Toishan. So immigrants from Taishan represented about half of all Chinese people in the United States until 1940. These generations of Chinese people in the United States, they spoke Cantonese or Taishanese as opposed to Mandarin, which has been the largest dialect group, and it's also been the national language of China since 1911. So the point I'm trying to make is that the immigrants who came from China to the United States, especially in this early period, come from one very particular part of China. They represent one particular, I would say, cultural group in China. They brought with them cultural practices from this part of China. They brought with them and also like architectural styles, like aesthetic fashions, these types of things from that part of China. This group of Chinese Cantonese also represent one of the largest diasporas in human history. So people from the Guangdong province of China went around the world. Oregon just happened to be one place where they ended up. And even though, early on in the talk I talked about how Chinese people settled across the state. That is definitely true. But yet, over time, Portland quickly became a de facto business and community hub for this population. In Portland, Chinese immigrants constituted a majority ethnic group in the city. They were second only to German arrivals in 1860, 1870, and 1910. White Portlanders, and indeed white Americans from all up and down the West Coast, took issue with the presence of Chinese people in the city. Even though the treatment of Chinese people in Portland in these early years was relatively mild compared to the treatment of Chinese people in other parts of the West. So during the 1860s and it really 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, you have these really concentrated years of anti-Chinese violence, and then it also picks up again in the early 1900s. But in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, economic opportunities began to dry up across the West. And with that, anti-Chinese sentiments increased, and racial violence escalated throughout the West. We see very specific acts of anti-Chinese violence taking place in Seattle, in Tacoma, in Los Angeles in 1871. We actually have the second largest mass lynching in U.S. history, which was in which Chinese people were the targets. There, I believe it was 17 or 19 Chinese people were lynched, and the Chinatown in Los Angeles was burned to the ground. White workers in the West turned against Chinese immigrants, believing that they represented unfair economic competition and believing that they took jobs that rightfully belonged to white people. In this region, in Oregon City, a mob of men drove about 40 to 50 Chinese mill workers out of Oregon City in 1886. They forced them onto a steamboat that took them up the river, up the Willamette to Portland. That same type of rounding up and driving out or just massacring did not occur in Portland. What we see happening in Portland instead is prominent and powerful Portlanders urged calm. And they made the case that Chinese people, while they couldn't and shouldn't be integrated into the mainstreams of society, were nonetheless needed for the development of the city. And so that's how racial violence, that's how that was kind of, that brought the mood down a little bit. So the Chinese question of what to do with Chinese people, this went from being a West Coast issue to a national issue, beginning in the 1876 presidential election. Democrats and Republicans in this election both wanted to win Western votes. And so anti-Chinese leaders, which primarily comprised of labor unions, successfully leveraged the power of the regional electorate to demand that lawmakers in D.C. take action against Chinese immigration. Anti-Chinese advocates wanted to restrict Chinese immigration, and they supported the deportation of existing Chinese in the United States. In doing so, they presented Chinese people in a very particular way that has kind of established the stereotyping of Chinese people and of Asian people up until the present day, probably. they presented Chinese men and women as fundamentally, culturally, morally, biologically incompatible with their American counterparts. This rhetoric led, and this violence across the West led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. The Chinese Exclusion Act was, during this time, the most comprehensive immigration law. It was the first of its kind. This act barred the entry of Chinese laborers. There were some classes of Chinese people who were exempt from these restrictions, including students, teachers, travelers, merchants, and diplomats. The U.S. wanted to maintain good diplomatic and trade relations with China, but they did not want, they really felt, I think policymakers really felt the pressure from anti-Chinese activists who were crying out that Chinese laborers were stealing jobs from white laborers. So this act also prohibited all Chinese people from obtaining naturalized citizenship. So the population that was already in America could not become citizens. And if they decided to return to China and then come back again to America, as I said, many immigrants did at the time, there would be trouble. This law would not be overturned until 1943. During World War II, when China allied with the United States against Japan. And the overturning of this law in 1943 was a largely symbolic gesture. China was granted a quota of 103 immigrants per year. This Chinese exclusion would not be more thoroughly overturned until 1965, with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of '65. Which was passed in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War. So it was passed alongside the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So it's kind of, it lived in that same, I guess like in that same ethos, the same thinking that pushed those changes through. Chinese exclusion is really important to understanding American immigration history, and also I think understanding the very, what's happening now. So this act becomes the cornerstone of how Americans come to view immigration, and not just Chinese immigration, like all immigration. This was a turning point after which the U.S. increasingly restricted its borders. It legalized xenophobia on an unprecedented scale. It created a category of illegal immigration, and it defined those who fell into this category as criminals, thereby pushing immigrants who entered the country, quote unquote, illegally into the margins of society. So this wasn't a law that only affected Chinese people. It would come to influence all subsequent immigration restrictions. This is a moment when the U.S. stopped becoming a nation that welcomed immigrants with open doors and begins to think of immigration as something that needs to be controlled. And the way this is also, it's like you can restrict immigration in any number of ways. Immigration was not really restricted before this, so they could have come up with any idea. But the way that this idea was formed, it wasn't, the policymakers didn't choose to impose just a broad numerical quota. They didn't say, okay, from this point on, we're going to allow in 500,000 immigrants a year, period. Immigrants from anywhere, 500,000, first come, first served. It didn't happen like that. Instead, what happened was this law, it was guided by a thinking about which groups of people deserved and didn't deserve to come into the United States. It was guided by a thinking of which groups of people could or should and could not and should not become American. It's not a stretch of the imagination to say that the Exclusion Act transformed how Americans thought about immigration itself. Not just Chinese immigration, but like immigration period, and who does and does not get to become an American. Chinese people in the United States and in China recognize the racism behind the Exclusion Act. They viewed this law as unjust, as morally and socially illegitimate, and thus unworthy of compliance. We know this in part because Chinese people on both sides of the Pacific engaged in elaborate processes to circumvent these restrictions. And they used litigation as well to challenge the legalities of restrictions. So there is a constant push, there is an organized pushback against this on part of Chinese people in the United States and Chinese people in China. People also just straight up disobeyed and defied these laws. And one of the ways they did this was through the paper sons system. So the way that the paper sons system worked was the Chinese Exclusion Act specifically banned Chinese laborers while allowing the entry of people who classified themselves or identified themselves as merchants, diplomats, students, tourists, and returning laborers. And so for would-be migrants, they quickly learned how to present themselves to immigration authorities as anything other than a Chinese laborer. And typically they posed as a member of the exempted elite. More often than not, they posed as a merchant. Or they would pose as a relative of a merchant who was already in the United States. Soon enough, what we see, because Chinese people live transnational lives and because there exists complex networks of business and trade, we see an entire multinational business arising around the circumvention of exclusion laws. This strategy of getting Chinese people into the United States was known as the paper son system, in which you basically pose as somebody else and you have falsified papers to claim that you are such. This strategy was so prevalent during the exclusion era that many present-day Chinese Americans who can trace their family history back to this time period find paper sons and daughters among their ancestors. It was relatively common. So I want to bring it back to Portland just a little bit before I wrap up. We can see the impacts of Chinese exclusion when we compare Portland's two historic Chinatowns in Southwest Portland and in Northwest Portland. So Portland's first Chinatown was in what is now Southwest Portland, kind of this downtown core of Portland. It stretched from approximately Burnside to the Montgomery Bridge, or to Montgomery Boulevard, which is what connects to the Hawthorne Bridge. Sorry? No, I think it's Montgomery because it's Hawthorne. It's not the Morrison Bridge. So it's even further south. So it went from Burnside to Montgomery, from Front to 6th. It was in existence from roughly the 1860s to the 1910s. There is virtually nothing left of this neighborhood, of the Chinese presence of this neighborhood. Old Chinatown was developed in the decades before the Chinese Exclusion Act took hold. So at its peak in 1900, 1910, this was actually the second largest Chinatown after San Francisco. Because this neighborhood took shape before exclusion was passed, it possessed a relative degree of economic and generational diversity. There were men, women, and children. There were families. There were an array of Chinese-owned businesses. Some of Portland's first restaurants, it's believed, were Chinese-owned businesses in this part of the city. This was also a relatively multi-ethnic neighborhood as well. Immigrants belonging to the merchant class oftentimes brought wives and children, which really complicates the stereotype of Chinatowns being bachelor societies. Here is the Lun Chin family, circa 1900. I believe what we see here is 2 generations of this family. The daughter, Moy Young, I'm not sure if this is the baby that they're holding. I think it's another child in this photograph. But the daughter, Moy Young, is actually believed to be the first Chinese child born in Oregon. And she was born in 1866. That's like, it's 1 year after the Civil War. Right, she was here this family is actually still in Portland, so they are like 5th, 6th generation Oregonians. They've been here for a long time. For those of you who are familiar with Portland, you might know of the restaurant Hung Far Low. This descendants of the Lun Chin family would own and operate Hung Far Low. So between 1900 and 1915, Portland experienced a population and building boom that would directly affect Old Chinatown and its residents. This is the time period of the Lewis and Clark Centennial Fair, which, we generally think of this was when Portland really blew up. So in the eyes of city leaders, the land south of Burnside was becoming far too valuable to be a Chinatown. This population boom also coincided with the passage and repeated renewals of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So for Chinese people who were in Portland at this time, they faced 2 formidable challenges. Not only did they have to navigate increasing restrictions and discrimination, they were also being priced and pushed out of their places of residence and their businesses. So what we see in Portland is between 1900 and 1930, Portland's general population booms. It goes from 90,000 people to 300,000 people. The Chinese population of Portland drops from 1,800 people to 1,500 people. During this time, many old Chinatown business owners sold their operations and moved away. Some left Portland altogether, but many moved across Burnside and settled in what is now Northwest Portland, what is now, where the Chinatown Gate is in downtown Portland. This part of Old Town was a multi-ethnic neighborhood that was home to Japanese immigrants, Germans, Scandinavians, Greek, Romani, and Blacks. This neighborhood would come to be known as New Chinatown. In some ways, this new Chinatown, here's an image of New Chinatown. This was much more of an ethnic enclave than Old Chinatown was. It was a lot more ghettoized than Old Chinatown. New Chinatown would develop much firmer and fixed borders. It wasn't easy for Chinese people who lived in New Chinatown to move out of New Chinatown because of restriction in the rest of the city. It wasn't easy for folks to find economic opportunities outside of this neighborhood either. But, nonetheless, life continued. People eked out a living. They built community. They found joy. They made a life for themselves and their kin in Portland and across the state. And they became Americans, at least culturally speaking, during the exclusion years when they weren't allowed to become naturalized. And they became American in part by adopting some American customs, but also because their long-term presence in the United States broadened and changed, however unconsciously, the very definitions and ideas of what it means to be an American. That is it. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think that I've worked with what we call them like Portland old timers, and they're folks who grew up in Portland's Chinatown at this point like between the 1930s to the 1950s. So this is a little bit later. But they, those kids they talk about going to Portland, to public schools in Portland. But as far as this earlier population, I'm not totally certain. I do know that some kids of elite Chinese Oregonians attended private schools in the city, like Mount Scott Military Academy, or I don't know, that's like the only one that comes to mind. But I know that they did attend private schools. And I know that Chinese kids in Portland, beginning from 1911 on, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, which is a community organization, they opened a Chinese school for kids to learn Chinese. And that school operated after American school. So I guess if this is kind of, by process of elimination, you can kind of, infer that kids were going to school. They were going to public school during school time. And then beginning from 1911 on, they had to go after school to Chinese school for 6 days a week. And this continued for quite some time. And I think that for a lot of folks for a lot of the old timers who grew up going to Chinese school, there's kind of this shared hatred or resentment of having to go to school after American school 6 days a week. I hope that helps to answer the question. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that history. It's fascinating. Through your talk, it's remarkable how many of these themes we're living with today or coming up with. We haven't learned from our cable history.
And it less than 60 years, and then in 1924, that was when they created all the immigration laws, rolled back so that it was the people from Northern Europe that were allowed and the Italians weren't allowed.
Yeah.
This history is our history.
Yeah. Yeah.
The current administration issued an executive order called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, right? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there is a general, it's kind of like that Instagram versus reality meme where there's this sense, people think that they have a sense of how history is made, how history, I guess what I'm trying to say is there is what history is, right? History is this combination of facts and interpretation. There are facts, we are all in this room today. This is a fact. I was born in Silver Spring, Maryland. That is a fact. You can't contest it. But George Washington was the first president. Can't contest that. But then there's interpretation, right? So how do people talk about George Washington's presidency? How do people talk about George Washington's legacy? And that's the work of historians. It's the work of historians to use the archives, to use primary sources to develop an informed interpretation of what the resources are telling them. And so, that being said, it's you can have multiple interpretations. That's just kind of just how it is. You're going to have multiple stories. You're going to have different ways of talking about it. And so that, I guess the idea of restoring truth and sanity, it's just what does that mean? It's not relevant to how history is done. You know what I mean? you have to have an existence of many different historical narratives. Some of them can be and probably are politicized or informed by, the maker's politics, regardless of what their politics are. And then some can just be what they are, and they all exist together. So I guess.
But isn't it a form of erasure? I mean,
Yeah.
it's another way to say it didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, yes, like more directly, it's.
It's giving life to narratives such as slavery wasn't that bad.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Conversation.
Yeah. To me, like, it just, I don't know, like, to me, it feels like that argument, or that, I guess I'm thinking about it on like an intellectual level, like not even in practice, which obviously there are very damaging effects to this. But like on an intellectual level, I'm just like this is like based on a fundamental misunderstanding or like unknowing of how you do history, like how a historian does history. It's a craft. So it's just like, how does this enter into the equation? I don't know. I have a question over here, and then.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask relates something to what you're talking about now. Several years ago, I read a piece regarding a group of Chinese immigrants, prospectors along the Snake River.
Oh, yeah.
In Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, and some of the local farmers disagreed with that whole idea and performed what I heard was the Chinese massacre. Can you add any information to that?
Yeah, this did happen. It happened on the Snake River. There were a camp of Chinese gold miners, like panning, not even mining, like panning for gold. In that area. It was super remote, is my understanding. And a group of, they were farmers, but they were also horse thieves, which I think adds like a level of what? So this group of townspeople they wanted to rob them, I think. And in the end, all of the miners, all of the members of the Chinese camp, it is believed, were massacred, were murdered by this group of horse thieves. And they weren't ever able to get the full story. And as you can imagine, also the perpetrators were... their identities were made known and nothing ever happened to them, even though I believe they were tried as well. And then I think that there was some say that there was a broader cover-up on the part of the town to even admit that this had happened. There's a great book by Gregory Noakes about, I think it's just called Massacre on Snake River or something.
One of the things I remember is that they didn't discover the incident for a week or so because when they began to wash up downstream,
Yeah, it was.
investigation ensued, and certain people disappeared from town, moved to Idaho or wherever, and families of those people still live there.
Wow. I didn't know about that. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, it was, my understanding of it, yes, it was that remains, like bodies were just washing up for months after it happened. So, for 30, yeah. There's a great book. There's also an OPB documentary on it too. Gregory Noakes, Nokes. Do you have a question?
Yes. Considering the administration that we have now, it seems to be erasing all kinds of history, from school books, banning books. What would you suggest that people do to help stop this from happening. I mean, it is happening, it's happening. But
It's,
we're stuck, you know.
yeah,
It's a crime,
I know.
and it's the same thing as this.
It's the same, you know, I mean, I think,
What can we do?
I don't know. I think there's, you know, I think that there's a need to like, to lean on your community, maybe to make sure that knowledge is shared within your community. I think, you know, there's, what it seems to me is that as knowledge, as the sharing of knowledge is being erased, like through these like really big channels, right? I mean, you have to go underground, so to speak, right? You have to look at these more informal like areas where knowledge is shared with, you know, within communities, within, I don't really know. Yeah.
In response to that, I think one of the things we can do is be present at lectures.
Yes, and the work that you do.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, with cultural institutions, so I work for I work for a large cultural institution in Seattle, and we've, you know, cultural institutions everywhere are really suffering from federal funding being cut. This is the case with schools, it's everything. One of the things that I think a lot of organizations are doing is to, rather than to like, I think people are trying to fly under the radar, so to speak. They're trying to figure out how the censorship works and how you can continue to express the ideas that you want to express without, you know, triggering. Yes, without being a target. So like, how do you do, and it's, you know, I think I don't know, I think that it's hard. And there is like I think there's a need to just like to stay engaged.
When you did your research, was it the majority of it was in Seattle or here at the Oregon Historical Society?
So I have actually, I haven't actually done any archival research here. It's a little bit, I'm like, but yeah, I think that my research, I read a lot, so I'm drawing upon the research of others, and I'm presenting it as a synthesis of what is happening within the field in this present moment. But I will say that most of this research that these scholars have done is in Oregon. And so this is about the state. This isn't even like there's been a lot more work done in Washington, a ton of more work done in California, but not that much work done in Oregon. Like I think when people think of Chinese history Chinese American history in the West, they think of California and they think of Washington. They don't think of Oregon. And yet there is this whole past here that is really, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I'm able to do this work is because there's just like not that many people doing this work here. Sylvie, are we at time? We can talk afterwards.
Yes, just 2 weeks ago, a group of us in Gresham here hosted a meeting with our state Secretary of State, Tobias Reed, and he is on the education committee in the state. And he was very strongly opposed to the whole idea of censorship, very much opposed.
Yeah.
I could also add that all of our local legislators are on the same page. Senator Frederick, sponsored a bill in the legislature, which I believe passed, prohibiting those kinds of restrictions within the state.
I think that it feels like, at least here, there's a shift toward like really working with with your local, with the local governments and like the state, you know, just that state federal balance, like I think it has tipped a little bit.
It's population centers in both states, though, it isn't the whole state. And the same
That
in
is true.
Washington.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you get out of the major metropolitan areas and it's a very different story.
That is very true. That is very true. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.